Today, I want to share with you a deeper understanding of something that drives nearly every decision, desire, and goal in our lives: dopamine. Dopamine is not just the pleasure molecule, as it's often misrepresented. It's the molecule of motivation, anticipation, and drive. It's the neurochemical that helps us pursue goals, stay focused in the face of obstacles, and, when properly regulated, leads to a more balanced, deeply satisfying life. But here's the catch: dopamine is not unlimited, and the way we interact with our environment, our phones, food, substances, even social media, can cause real shifts in our dopamine system. When mismanaged, we experience burnout, anxiety, lack of motivation, and chronic dissatisfaction. But when managed correctly, dopamine becomes a powerful tool for sustained motivation, sharp focus, and authentic joy. The good news: you can learn to control your dopamine system, not by eliminating pleasure, but by understanding how it works and learning how to work with it, not against it. So let's break down how to do this. These are 6 key principles for mastering your dopamine for motivation, focus, and real satisfaction. One of the most critical insights into dopamine is that it works on a relative system. It responds more to contrast than absolute levels. If your brain becomes accustomed to high stimulation throughout the day, scrolling, snacking, video content, then activities that once brought joy or focus will feel flat. You haven't lost your ability to enjoy life. Your dopamine system has adapted to a constantly elevated baseline. It's like turning up the volume so high that you can no longer hear the details. To reverse that, you need to reintroduce contrast into your life. That means giving your brain space without stimulation. It's not punishment, it's a recalibration. When you take time away from hyper-stimulating behaviors, even simple things, a walk, a conversation, a deep work session, begin to feel intrinsically rewarding again. This is a powerful way to rebuild motivation without needing to chase constant novelty. There's also a physiological layer to dopamine that matters. Dopamine is synthesized from the amino acid tyrosine, which comes from protein-rich foods. But more importantly, its release and recycling are highly influenced by sleep architecture, circadian timing, and stress levels. For instance, poor sleep lowers the availability of dopamine receptors in the brain's reward pathways, making it harder to experience motivation even when dopamine is present. This is why sleep deprivation leads to a paradoxical mix of low energy and compulsive seeking of rewards, junk food, procrastination, or stimulation. Bright light exposure, especially within the first hour of waking, plays a powerful role in anchoring the brain's dopamine system. Early daylight stimulates retinal ganglion cells, which send signals to brain areas involved in mood, motivation, and focus. It's not just about feeling more alert. This morning light sets a cascade that affects your dopamine rhythms throughout the day. Miss it, and you're working against your own biology. Movement is another lever. Exercise, especially non-exhaustive, rhythmic movement like walking or Zone 2 cardio, and increase dopamine receptor availability and improve your system's sensitivity to rewards. In essence, movement acts like a reset button, but you don't need intense workouts to gain the benefits. Even short bouts of movement, done consistently, help stabilize motivation. Let's also talk about reward prediction error, a principle in neuroscience that describes how dopamine spikes when outcomes exceed expectations and drops when they fall short. You can use this to your advantage by setting small, achievable targets that gradually escalate. Each time you hit or slightly exceed your target, your brain gets a controlled dopamine hit, training it to associate motivation with steady progress instead of massive, unrealistic goals. Lastly, understand that environmental cues, the people, spaces, and routines around you, can become wired to your dopamine system. This is known as cue-induced craving. For example, if you always check your phone in bed, the bed itself becomes a cue to seek dopamine. Changing your environment even slightly breaks these loops. Strategic separation of activities, work in one area, rest in another, teaches your brain to associate context with intentional outcomes. This is not about hacking dopamine. It's about aligning your biology with behavior, creating a feedback loop where effort fuels motivation and motivation reinforces effort. Voluntary discomfort is another powerful method to strengthen the dopamine system. When you deliberately engage in something effortful, cold exposure, fasting, hard physical training, you're teaching your nervous system to find meaning and reward in stress with structure. These activities spike norepinephrine and modestly increase dopamine, but more importantly, they train your system to tolerate discomfort in pursuit of a goal. That tolerance creates more room for motivation to flourish, especially in environments where challenge is unavoidable. The key is controllability. When the brain knows you are voluntarily entering a difficult state, the stress becomes adaptive. If it's forced or chronic, the same stress can suppress dopamine. But when chosen and time-bound, discomfort becomes a kind of neurological training. Over time, your brain begins to associate effort with reward at a chemical level. You no longer rely on instant gratification. You become driven by purpose and process. Another technique is visualization of effort, not just success. It's a subtle but crucial shift. Most people visualize the end goal, winning the race, completing the project, receiving praise. But studies show that visualizing the grind, the struggle, the repetition actually primes the brain for sustained dopamine release during those hard moments. It builds psychological endurance and reduces the likelihood of quitting when things get difficult. You're not imagining escape, you're rehearsing resilience. Dopamine is also closely tied to novelty, but novelty doesn't have to mean chaos. It simply means introducing small variations into routine, changing your work environment slightly, altering your workout, adjusting the time of day you do a task. This taps into the brain's need for surprise and pattern recognition. You're giving your dopamine system enough variability to stay engaged without derailing focus with constant change. Digital environments often override these systems. When you get constant feed, back likes, messages, notifications, you bypass natural effort-based dopamine release. You're being rewarded for mere exposure, not effort. Over time, this rewires the brain to seek reward without investment. To counter this, build reward contingencies. Only check your messages after completing a hard task, or only consume entertainment after productive work. This makes the reward meaningful again and strengthens the dopamine circuitry around accomplishment. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change, follows the direction of focus and effort. When dopamine is released during effort, the brain literally rewires itself to want more of that effort. But if you only release dopamine at the end of a task, or from distractions during the task, the brain learns to prefer escape. That's why it's so powerful to internally reward yourself while doing the hard part. A simple internal phrase like "this is the part that counts," or "this is where I'm building strength," can link effort with pleasure at the neurological level. Your internal state, mindset, perception, self-talk is not fluff. It's a biochemical interface. And when you learn to link that internal narrative with behaviors that support dopamine regulation, you gain control over your motivation in a sustainable, grounded way. This is a form of biological self-mastery rooted in science, reinforced by consistent practice. One of the most underutilized but powerful strategies for optimizing dopamine is timing your rewards. When you delay gratification, even by just a few minutes, you build stronger, more resilient dopamine pathways. This is because the brain encodes not just the reward itself, but the time and effort that led to it. If you finish a deep work session or a training block and wait a little before giving yourself the dopamine hit, whether that's food, rest, or leisure, you teach your nervous system to crave the pursuit, not just the outcome. This is the foundation of what's called temporal discounting. The further away a reward is perceived to be, the less dopamine it generates in anticipation, unless you actively build tolerance for that delay. You can train this by gradually increasing the gap between effort and reward. For example, instead of reaching for your phone the moment you finish a task, sit with the feeling of completion for 60-90 seconds. Let your system settle, then reward. That delay creates a neurochemical imprint that says, effort first, then pleasure. Habits built around effort, dependent dopamine, also tend to be more stable over time. If your motivation comes purely from external factors, likes, recognition, numbers, you're constantly at the mercy of variability. But if you learn to generate internal dopamine through process engagement, the behavior becomes self-reinforcing. You begin to crave the feeling of doing the work itself. That's the transition from dependence to autonomy in the dopamine system. It's also important to understand the concept of tonic versus phasic dopamine. Tonic dopamine is your background level. It determines your general mood, drive, and capacity to initiate tasks. Phasic dopamine, on the other hand, is the sharp rise you feel in response to something exciting or rewarding. You can influence tonic levels over time with behaviors like sleep, sunlight, fasting, cold exposure, and effort-based training. Phasic spikes, however, must be managed carefully. Too frequent, and they crash your baseline. Too rare, and you lose drive. The key is not to chase the spikes, but to build a solid foundation through consistent behaviors that elevate your tonic state. Micro-routines can also help here. The nervous system responds well to predictable structure with slight variability. Starting your day with the same general sequence, wake, hydrate, move, get sunlight, primes dopamine circuits for forward motion. This is known as behavioral momentum. Once the system is moving, it's easier to sustain effort. But if you start the day with high dopamine activities like scrolling or passive entertainment, you've already peaked before doing anything meaningful. That leaves you with little chemical motivation for the harder tasks ahead. This is why what you do first in the day matters so much. It sets your dopamine tone. Begin with something low stimulation but goal-oriented: journaling, planning, walking, reading. Let the first dopamine release come from intentionality, not distraction. Then stack progressively harder tasks as your system warms up. You're not just managing time, you're managing neurochemistry by design. Repeated behaviors, when paired consistently with dopamine release, become automated neural loops. These loops are how habits are formed, not just mentally, but chemically. If you repeatedly reward procrastination with a dopamine hit from scrolling, the brain learns that avoidance equals pleasure. But the reverse is also true. If you pair focus and discipline with internal or structured reward, the brain begins to default toward productive effort. Over time, this rewiring becomes automatic action, precedes motivation, not the other way around. This is crucial. Waiting to feel motivated before acting is a misunderstanding of how the system works. Dopamine doesn't just show up passively. It is often created by action itself. When you take even small steps toward a goal, your brain rewards you with dopamine, and that chemical feedback loop makes you more likely to continue. This is known as the action-reward cycle, and it's one of the most powerful tools for overcoming inertia. There's also a deep connection between goal setting and dopamine flow. The brain thrives on progress, not perfection. When a goal is too distant or vague, dopamine struggles to maintain its trajectory. But when a larger goal is broken into specific, trackable micro goals, every completion becomes a mini spike in motivation. Think of this as precision, targeted dopamine engineering. Each small win reinforces the pathway that says, "I'm making progress." You don't have to finish the marathon today. You just have to take the next step. Equally important is avoiding hedonic saturation. When everything becomes pleasurable all the time, nothing feels rewarding. This is especially true in environments filled with convenience and entertainment. The brain adapts to constant stimulation by reducing the number or sensitivity of dopamine receptors, a process called downregulation. The result, a chronic sense of boredom, restlessness, or apathy, even in the presence of abundance. The antidote is simple but not easy: earn your dopamine. When you reintroduce friction between desire and reward, the brain regains its capacity to experience satisfaction. This might mean delaying a favorite treat until after a hard task, or turning down short-term indulgence in favor of long-term gain. Over time, this restores both sensitivity and meaning. Crucially, none of this requires perfection. The dopamine system is plastic. It adapts to what you consistently do. If you've been relying on quick hits or passive reward systems, you haven't failed. You've simply trained your system in one direction. The moment you begin reconditioning it through effort, structure, and delayed gratification, the brain starts to change. What matters most is consistency over intensity. You don't need radical shifts. You need daily behaviors that cue dopamine release through intentional effort-driven action. Even if the reward is small, checking off a list, completing a set, finishing a paragraph, the neurochemical signal is real and it accumulates. This is the science of self-direction, using biology to build autonomy, resilience, and long-term fulfillment. As your behaviors begin to align with effort-based dopamine release, something deeper starts to occur. Your identity begins to shift. Neurochemically, this happens because the brain doesn't just record what you do, it tracks how you feel while doing it. When dopamine is released during moments of focused effort, your nervous system interprets that as a signal of alignment. This is who I am, this is what matters. Over time, your internal narrative transforms from "I have to do this" to "this is what I do." This is how behavior becomes identity. Meaning, then, is not an abstract concept. It is a biological experience, often driven by a well-regulated dopamine system. People who report higher life satisfaction typically engage in activities that require sustained effort, delayed gratification, and long-term goals. These individuals don't necessarily chase peak pleasure. They cultivate deep engagement, often referred to in psychology as flow states. And while flow is multifactorial, dopamine plays a key role in initiating and sustaining it. To reach flow, your brain must experience a balance between challenge and skill. If the task is too easy, there's no dopamine pull. If it's too difficult, the system becomes overwhelmed and stress chemistry dominates. The sweet spot, just outside your comfort zone, activates a neurochemical cocktail that includes dopamine, norepinephrine, and endorphins. This state is intrinsically rewarding, and it builds a feedback loop of motivation, learning, and satisfaction. Another powerful but under-discussed aspect of dopamine regulation is its relationship with emotional resilience. When your dopamine system is stable, meaning your baseline is healthy and you aren't constantly spiking and crashing, you become more emotionally adaptable. This is because dopamine interacts with other systems, particularly serotonin and the prefrontal cortex, which are involved in emotional regulation and executive function. In simple terms, a balanced dopamine system creates a wider emotional bandwidth, allowing you to tolerate discomfort, bounce back from setbacks, and stay connected to purpose even in difficulty. This is especially relevant in a culture that often promotes overstimulation and immediate gratification. In that environment, resilience becomes compromised, not due to weakness, but due to neurochemical depletion. If your brain is exhausted from constant dopamine seeking, it doesn't have the capacity to handle complexity or delay. That's not a moral failing, it's a biological outcome. To build back resilience, one of the most effective tools is intentional stillness, time without stimulation, without screens, without input. Even 10-20 minutes per day of quiet, reflective time, such as walking, journaling, or breath work, allows the dopamine system to recalibrate. It resensitizes your brain to subtle forms of pleasure, calm, clarity, insight. These are slow dopamines, but they are powerful. They carry more weight, more depth, and more longevity than the sharp bursts that fade quickly. By learning to regulate your dopamine system through effort, timing, challenge, and intention, you become the architect of your own motivation and emotional stability. This isn't about pushing harder, it's about working smarter with your biology, designing your life around principles that reward progress, not just stimulation. Human behavior is not shaped by dopamine in isolation. It is also heavily influenced by social reinforcement. Our dopamine systems are sensitive to approval, recognition, and status. Evolutionarily, this made sense. Being accepted by the group often meant survival. In modern environments, however, this wiring can be hijacked by artificial signals, likes, views, applause, leading to external validation replacing internal alignment. This can create an unstable dopamine architecture, where motivation becomes reactive rather than self-generated. To regain control, the goal is not to eliminate social feedback, but to detach your core motivation from it. When your dopamine system is primarily driven by internal benchmarks, such as learning, creating, building, or contributing, your motivation becomes more stable and less fragile. You still experience satisfaction from recognition, but it becomes supplemental, not central. This distinction allows for long-term consistency because the behavior is not tied to fluctuating external cues. One of the most profound shifts you can create in the brain is moving from outcome-dependent behavior to identity-based behavior. This is when your focus shifts from "what will I get from this" to "what kind of person does this action reinforce me to become?" When you take consistent, effort-driven actions and pair them with internal reward, like tracking progress, reflecting on growth, or connecting the task to a larger purpose, dopamine helps encode those behaviors into your identity structure. This ties directly into neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself through repetition and attention. Dopamine is a key player in this process. It flags certain experiences as important and worthy of being remembered or repeated. That means every time you pair dopamine with a positive behavior, you are literally telling your brain, "Do more of this." But the inverse is also true. If distraction, procrastination, or avoidance get rewarded, especially with pleasurable stimuli, your brain encodes those patterns just as strongly. That's why being mindful of how you reward yourself matters as much as what you do. If you complete a hard task and reward yourself with 5 minutes of social media, you're not necessarily reinforcing the productive behavior. You may be reinforcing the distraction. A better strategy is to pair the end of a task with something that reflects progress, reviewing what you learned, preparing for the next step, or even using a short walk to consolidate the mental effort. These small post-effort rituals can dramatically enhance how deeply a behavior is encoded. There's also value in neutral space, moments after effort, when you resist the urge to immediately shift into stimulation. These gaps help your dopamine system stabilize rather than spike and crash. Just sitting with a sense of accomplishment, breathing slowly, letting your mind settle. This helps preserve your dopamine baseline while reinforcing that effort itself is rewarding. Over time, what emerges is a lifestyle that's not driven by craving, but by clarity. You begin to act not out of compulsion, but from conviction. Your behaviors align with long-term goals because they are reinforced by your biology, not in opposition to it. This is sustainable motivation, grounded in neuroscience, cultivated through design.